My name is Wendy Pearson and I'm the Chair of Women's Studies and Feminist Research. I just want to welcome you to our annual Women's Studies Feminist Research Conference, which, as you know, this year is tackling the theme of gender-based violence. First off, I want to say that we're very sorry that our first scheduled speaker, Bonnie Braden, was unable to make it here today due to unexpected health issues. We want to wish her all the best for a speedy recovery. As things stand, we still have a great day ahead of us and a number of speakers who will offer perspectives on one of the most critical issues of the present day. Gender-based violence is still very much a part of people's lives all around the globe, and work to understand it is incredibly important in the global effort to improve the circumstances of people affected by it. Knowledge is a powerful tool for improving the efforts and strategies of everyone who is working to address gender-based violence, no matter where, no matter when, and we hope to explore many of these today. In addition, I would particularly like to thank many people from community organisations who have chosen to join us today. Partnerships between academics and the broader community are also very important in helping us to address gender-based violence. So I'm especially pleased to see so many of you here today joining us. And finally, I'd like to thank the conference organiser, Bipasha Barua, for her work in putting the day together with the assistance of our administrative staff and a small host of volunteers. So thank you, all of you. Without these people, today would not be possible. Nor would it be possible without the generous financial assistance of multiple organisations, including the Office of the Vice President Research, the Faculties of Social Science and of Health Sciences, Schulich Medicine and Dentistry, the Department of Economics, and of course the Eleanor Ratcliffe Fund, whose generous donations have made possible the creation of our annual conference, which is now, by the way, in its 11th year. It's such an important part of the department's academic work. So welcome everybody and enjoy the day.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to introduce Dr. Lina Sunseri. Dr. Sunseri is a professor of sociology in the School of Behavioral and Social Sciences at Brescia University College. She is the author of Being Again of One Mind, Oneida Women and the Struggle for Decolonization, published by UBC in 2011. She has also co-edited Racism, Colonialism, and Indigeneity, co-edited with Martin Cannon, and Colonialism and Racism in Canada, Historical Traces and Contemporary Issues, co-edited with Maria Wallace and Grace Edward Galabuzzi. In an article written about Dr. Sunseri's work, she states that her research was inspired by her personal experience as a member of the Oneida Nation and by her graduate studies at York University, where she discovered that a lot of the discussions and readings were not reflective of her experiences. She says, "It's not that I completely rejected other theories, but a lot of feminist theories don't really reflect the experiences of Oneida women. My research critiques and fills a gap for Indigenous nations. I am adding to that knowledge." We are happy to welcome Dr. Sunseri to our conference today to present her work, Can't Reconcile This, Racialized Gendered Violence Across Turtle Island.
Thank you, Sarah. Sarah used to be a student of mine at Brescia, so I know her well. That's nice. Thank you, Sigoli. Lina, my name is Lina Sunseri, my English or Italian name, and my Oneida name is Yelewisaks, which means gathering stories, knowledge. I'm a citizen of the Oneida Nation of the Thames, which is one of the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and then I'm of the Turtle clan, and I'm a professor at Brescia University College, and I'm also a daughter, a sister, an auntie, and mommy to my little kitties, and so on. So many hats that I fill in. So first of all, I want to give thanks to the first original peoples in the territory in which we're sitting, the Salvadoran people, and then the later other indigenous nations, they came to also settle here, and also other people from all over the world, they came to take a place here in London, Ontario. I also want to give thanks to the Creator for allowing us to be here and all together and all our relations so that we can now hear some words that need to be spoken with an open mind, open heart, and especially today, considering what just happened in Toronto a few days ago, I think it's very timely, this conference. I want to start, first of all, with the video. I gotta get this right. Oh, yeah. I'm going to start with the video. It's actually a song, Strong Women's Stories song, and I want to start with that. But first of all, because songs are very one of the ceremonial ways in which indigenous nations start a gathering, and there are other ways. Alex imagine, but sometimes there are issues around that, in physical structures here. So a song is one of the other ways. When we sing and drum, we are calling our ancestors to guide us, and also we're talking about their memories. We're trying to honor their memories when we do that. And in particular today, I want to honor the memories of the many, many women and girls that have died due to violence here across Turtle Island, which many of you instead call Canada. So we'll start with that. Also, it's important because it's called Strong Women's Stories, and the words are about that, is to, in a way, honor the strength and resilience of many Indigenous women in Canada and elsewhere that have resisted, survived, and warriors in this gender violence inflicted upon them. So I'm going to get this right, hopefully. If I know how to do this. Oh. I don't know how to do that. I have to get.
It's very tricky.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
It's okay.
I am a Mac person.
Nope.
No,
look at me too. We're both Mac people.
I'm a Mac person. So I was like, how can I do this? How can we just do Mac? There we go. There we go. Okay. Oh, there's no volume. If you know the song. Those should be maybe familiar to many of you, I hope. This is a picture of Tina Fontaine, a Colton Bushy. It was in the news the last few months. 2 Indigenous youth who were killed and whose death their justice was not served. I've chosen a title and starting with this picture of these 2 youth to remember the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report that just came out a few years ago, in which they called for action to address the highly disproportionate number of violence against Indigenous women and girls, and also the systemic barriers in the criminal justice system that exists in Canada against Indigenous peoples. And I want to start today by saying my argument that reconciliation, to truly materialize, we need real justice for Indigenous people. We can't have peace, we can't have healing, we can't have reconciliation until we have true peace and true justice. Otherwise, reconciliation, or those words, are just empty words used to appease the Canadian official narrative of a diverse, just, multicultural society to the world. But that's at the expense of the lives of many Indigenous people still today. These 2 cases of Tina and Colton exemplify the individual and systemic racism that still exists today in Canadian society. They both link to a history of racist stereotypes and constructions of an inferior other that is also criminalized. They also have 2 different genders in here, experienced a different side of the same coin, and that is racialized gender balance. In the case of Tina, her body was sexualized, devalued, dehumanized, and treated as rapeable, and ultimately inhumanely disposable. The body of Colton, similarly, was constructed to be feared, to be disliked, maybe even hated, devalued, criminalized, and similar to Tina's, ultimately inhumanely disposable. Both cases are a reminder to many of us, especially Indigenous peoples, that our Indigenous bodies and lives are objects of racial and sexual hatred and violence. It is my position, therefore, that we can't reconcile until Indigenous people's lives are respected, values, and they matter. These 2 individuals there are not just statistics, they're not just numbers, they're just not snapshots. They are a sister, a brother, a cousin, a daughter, a son, a friend, a human being. They were loved and are still loved, and they were robbed of a future. What we also need to acknowledge is that for many of us, we all know a Colton, we all know a Tina. And we all could easily be a Tina or a Colton. So therefore, for this to change, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people's relationships need to drastically change, and the social structures in our societies need to change. So how do we get to this? How do we get that once many centuries ago we had healthy Indigenous nations wherein gender balance existed, and now we don't? My talk today follows a very decolonizing intersectional analysis framework. But by that I mean that we need to recognize the impact of colonialism, racism, patriarchy, sexism on the lives of Indigenous peoples, especially women in our country, and to work towards dismantling all these systems of oppression collectively, and to recognize they all work together, the systems of oppression, to sustain hierarchical social relations in Canada. As this quote in here says, This quote is from a book that just came out from Lavelle, Bard, and Brand. And it says that to understand the severity of the tragedy facing indigenous women today, the history of subtle colonialism must be understood, a process deliberately and openly designed to eradicate the so-called Indian problem in North America by simply eliminating the Indian themselves. Indeed, our very existence as indigenous women poses a symbolic and physical threat to the dominant society. Why a threat? They argue, and I Simone argue, that our roles as life givers, as cultural carriers, as elders for many of indigenous nations or land title, our alone ability to reproduce indigenous children, therefore the future generation, hence nations, to which colonizers had to deal with, they were a threat to the colonial project historically. So in order to clear the path to subtle colonialism, historically we had this deliberate targeting of indigenous women as a way to attack indigenous nations themselves. We can see that through things like forced sterilization that occurred, the residential schooling system, the child welfare apprehension, so-called the 60 scoops, which did not die in the 60s, they are alive, and the many sexist, discriminatory legal policies and laws. So in a nation founded on the suffering and oppression of indigenous peoples, it should not come to any surprise that racist and sexist beliefs and practices coexisted, and they put indigenous lives, especially indigenous women's lives, at risk every day. Indigenous women and girls do not freely choose to live so-called high-risk lifestyles. They often do due to lack of real choices. Either maybe they lived in a so-called high-risk First Nations community with no housing, no clear and safe water, no appropriate health care, no equitable resources in education, or no employment opportunities. Therefore, they're often forced to leave their indigenous communities. And once they did, they often faced harsh realities in urban settings, living in the margins of Canadian society, isolated and therefore vulnerable to be exploited in order to survive, and therefore placed in very dangerous situations. However, the mainstream media and society and the justice system often indeed individualizes those social ills, and they often blame the victim. Even more so if these women are turned to sex work to survive. Because of the criminalization of sex work and the moral regulation of it and disdain of it, we know that that contributed to the lack of quick responses to the many missing women, indigenous women and girls in Canada. Is it as if the lives of sex workers, especially indigenous women sex workers, are less human, they're less valuable, and therefore easy targets for violence? So how did we get to this? Before settler colonialism happened, in many indigenous nations, especially matrilineal indigenous nations such as Oneida, one I am from, and all the Haudenosaunee ones are, indigenous women were respected, honored, and enjoyed sexual freedom, authority, and decision-making powers in their nations. Gender balance existed. In the case of, for example, matrilineal societies like Haudenosaunee, claim mothers held much authority. They were the land title holders of their communities. And they had, they were considered the heartbeat of the nations. if gender violence existed, I'm not denying it probably did, not trying to have this romanticized, idealized notion. However, there were many mechanisms in place to address it. No. When Europeans first started coming in this land, they saw something that was quite opposite to what they had left behind. So you need to just put yourself in what it was like Europe in 1600s, 1700s, and so on. And therefore, what the gender social relations looked like. So what they saw, in fact, was quite opposite to that. And therefore, in order for them to model what they had left behind, those indigenous equity that exists in indigenous nations had to be dismantled. And it is a slowly patriarchy and sexism infiltrated indigenous nations as well. So out of that, then we had the many racist and sexist stereotypes began to take place. A big one was the construction of so-called the squaw. Any femininity that distanced itself from this Victorian ideal of womanhood that was in place at that time was viewed as something that had to be disciplined, made docile, and modeled to European femininity. So therefore, negative stereotypes of indigenous women in particular became quite common. Also, family notions of Europeans at that time were quite in contrast to indigenous families at that time. Nuclear patriarchal families was not the norm for many indigenous nations. So again, those families that they saw were treated as dysfunctional, uncivilized, and therefore eventually patriarchy and sexism start to be implemented. A big part of this was definitely the Indian Act that still exists today. Has changed, but still here. The Indian Act and other simulatory colonial policies and practices had many lingering impact on indigenous peoples, but in particular indigenous women in Canada. One of the many things the Indian Act did was to establish new criteria of membership to indigenous so-called nations, because they're not the nations we know of. By establishing Indian status through the law, under patrilineal descent alone, to be recognized legally by the state as in quote-unquote Indian under the Indian Act, you have to be one of those things. You have to be an Indian male, registered under the Indian Act. Or you have to be a child of an Indian male, registered under the Indian Act. Or a wife of an Indian male, registered under the Indian Act. Therefore, many indigenous women could not automatically be categorized and treated legally as quote-unquote Indian, only through their affiliation with a male. This was quite a contrast to many matrilineal societies that in fact existed in Canada prior to this. While we have many provisions of this act by consistently the same patrilineal notion. And then, to make things even worse, in 1951, even if you as a female, through these three criteria, you qualified, as soon you married a non-registered male, you lost your status. And they could kick you out of the reserve. This one. And therefore, land claims didn't apply to you, those things. That's what happened to my mom, who married this gorgeous Italian man. And not me. Little did she know that the day she did that changed her life. So, and it was not, and interesting enough, okay, that my uncle, actually my two uncles, but one uncle would, both my mom and her had false status because both parents were registered. And then my uncle instead, he also married a non-Indian and a Scottish, not Italian, Scottish, blonde, blue eyes, nice woman, and had children as well. He did not lose his status, just because he so-called married out, did not lose his status, but women did lose their status. Even more discriminatory was that his wife gained status. This is definitely a good example when we in sociology, we say that race is a social construction. Because my mom, the day before marrying my dad, she belonged to so-called Indian race. The day after, she became white. How did that happen? Magic. My aunt was white. The day she married my uncle, became Indian. And she never lost that status because she did divorce and everything. So they were able to pass it on to their kids. My mom could not pass it on to me. So we both have similar ancestry, both my cousins and I, but treated very differently through the eyes of the Indian Act. She was able, because she never remarried, to also then, if wanted, pass along, kept that status, because she divorced but never remarried. She kept it. And also could pass it along to any child as long as she was unmarried. This changed eventually in 1985 after long legal battles all the way to the international tribunal in Geneva and so on, and eventually changed in 1985 with at that time called Bill C-31, wherein those women like my mom could regain their status and pass it along to myself. But until very recently, a few years ago, it stopped at me. Until very recently, for me to have been able before to pass it along to my children, if I wanted, I had to prove that their father was somebody that did not have status due to the changes in 1985 prior to that. That meaning that his parents never lost status to begin with, right? So we had divisions, within what we call 6-1 and 6-2. And if you're very good at math, you can kind of trace it back. I was never good at math. I got very confused. But one of the first things meant was that was a regulation of our sexuality for many indigenous women. Who do we have children with mattered for us. It was a very political decision. This is not traditional. This was never our ways to define membership to our nations. This was a colonial and racist legislation through the Indian Act. You have to also understand when I say colonial, that through the Indian Act, indigenous peoples, and particularly even more so indigenous women, I'll explain in a few minutes how, could not vote in our many levels of government. Therefore, this is a law, the Indian Act, until the 60s and so, imposed those definitions on indigenous nations without our consent, without even us being able to even vote those people in. That is colonialism as much as you can get. Right? It was also racism because it categorized peoples that did not consider ourselves to be one race. Just like many Europeans don't consider themselves to be one. We were homogenized into this one, treated as this other one. And therefore trying to eliminate all the many differences around languages, cultures, governance that existed within indigenous nations before this. And it was also done intentionally to limit the number of indigenous peoples that can qualify legally and Indian Act as Indians, because then the state has very less people to deal with, i.e. land titles. So therefore trying to eliminate them. Also, they imposed band council systems as a way of governance, when replacing it for traditional hereditary systems that we had in place. That also meant that, for example, women could not, until recently, could not hold office in those band councils now. Here we have clan mothers that had much political power before, and now they have removed those powers of indigenous women in their nations, right, through imposing this elected, so-called civilized, better democratic way to govern. So they could not vote, they could not hold office as well. And matrimonial property became under patrilineal as well. So we need to recognize that the impact of this is being quite drastic. What I meant is the devaluation, therefore the message here is the devaluation of indigenous women as their own free autonomous peoples, as leaders in their communities. Also, they were not free to belong in their communities if they so-called marry out until recently. The Native Women Association of Canada has reported, in fact, that many of the missing and murdered indigenous women that we hear about, those are women that in fact have lost status, and many of them still can get it, even through the changes that have happened recently. And therefore, they were forced to leave their communities. What's also interesting for us to acknowledge is that these women that have no status, but they're part of the missing murder, however, they're not officially counted in those statistics because they are not part of the status ones. But they very often, they're very visibly indigenous and therefore easy targets as other death status. So therefore the numbers are definitely a lot higher than the ones we know of. Residential schools, another form of colonialism, where we know now through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report that many forms of sexual and physical abuse were prevalent in the schools. And they shaped the experiences of girls and women who attended them and their generations that followed them. And intergenerational trauma continues to live in our communities, with the consequence of increased violence within indigenous communities. As the Native Women Association of Canada reported, violence and intergenerational trauma caused in the residential schooling system is not the only, but an underlying factor of the violence experienced by missing and murdered indigenous women's girls. Many of these women that have been reported in the statistics are women, or maybe their mothers they have gone to such schools. And they left them very traumatized, and they might have resorted to coping mechanisms such as substance addictions and so on, which therefore in turn made them quite vulnerable for sexual exploitation and violence. In addition to the residential schooling system, one that sometimes not as often discussed is the child welfare system, which is just as guilty. The removal of children from so-called dysfunctional families happened during the residential schools and later now. More children, as been reported, that more children are at the hands, were and are at the hands of child welfare agencies even more than they were, same numbers, and the height of the residential schools. So there's been always more actually children in child welfare agencies and foster care than actually in residential schools. Often being fostered in non-indigenous families. Studies have shown that the high rates of physical and sexual violence and psychological harm that those children have been exposed to in this child welfare system. They often been placed in hotels or going from home to home and disconnected from their indigenous families and cultures, communities. Many of those missing and murdered indigenous women girls had involvement within the child welfare system. Tina Fontaine, that I just showed you a picture of, she was one of those. She was a girl, young girl, that had lived a life of trauma, violence, and placed foster care at a hotel, and she was run away from it. So therefore, the state has been quite accomplice of this. This is also even further aggravated by the injustice delivery of the missing and murdered indigenous women and girls and many other forms of violences that both girls and boys and women and men really face. And there hasn't been that much outcry until recently or public alarm set. Which therefore, as this quote shows, it's important to note that in October, as early as 2004, the Amnesty International released a report together with the Native Women Association of Canada, or the so-called Stolen Sisters report, stating that was at that time there were officially over 500 indigenous women were victims of racialized and sexual violence. Later, years ago, the RCMP reported about 1,500 now since then. So numbers have increased. Things have not gotten better. They're getting worse. So there is a need for national tragedy, to consider this a national tragedy, national shame. What was even more shameful is how the prior federal government failed to respond, and so did the police and the justice system. Especially when at that time, the Stephen Harper quote, as you may have heard it, that it was not in his radar to deal with this when there were outcries and demands for an inquiry on the missing murdered indigenous women. So that was his response. So therefore, he couldn't even acknowledge the issue or show empathy or compassion. What message did that send when the prime minister of your country doesn't want to do that? What message does it send to all of us indigenous peoples, in particular girls and women, that our lives don't matter? It's not enough to care, to inquiry, to study, to address it. This is just the type of the iceberg, the missing murdered indigenous women. And those are very underreported, like I said, what actually qualifies them. Studies show that at least close to 4 times indigenous women are more likely to experience violence than non-indigenous women in Canada. But I have faith that many in this room care, and it's in your radar. So how do we move forward? I believe there has to be a collective effort coming from different areas. This is not an indigenous issue. It's a human issue. It's a gender issue. And we all have responsibility to end it. And do it in different ways. Each one has a different space to occupy this. We need to demand better from the police, from the justice system, from the media, from our own communities as well. To end all sexist, racist oppressions that exist. To nurture and love and make our indigenous youth feel that love. To feel that they are sacred, that they are valued, that they're more than just a statistic. To stop blaming the victim, to provide equitable resources to indigenous communities, organizations, social services to address this, and to analyze and address the root causes of it, or what puts these indigenous women's lives at risk every day. We saw what happened in Toronto a couple of days ago, and now it's coming in the open. Well, they don't want to say what it is. The underlying motive, an ideological, misogynist, sexist, patriarchal, homophobic, and everything, they're all there. They guided that act. It's a terrorist act. Meant to terrorize us just due to our gender variable. You feel that fear, I'm sure. That terror, to know that you could be easily a target because of that. When indigenous women have felt that since early settler colonialism, never escaped that we are easily targeted. And even my class background and any other things don't escape me for that. Then in addition to gender, there's also my indigeneity. It puts me higher risk. And also for others, other identities even more so. In many spaces in our society, in our own communities, in the workplaces, in the schools, in the streets. So we need to work together to end it. Indigenous women have never been idle. It's a carnival, ever. Always have assisted, always been warriors. At the forefront of any struggles against colonialism, against racism, etc., sexism. We have many women that have done so. They challenged the state. For example, Sharon McIver, Lynn Gale, Lavelle, Jeanette Lavelle, Bedard, they all challenged the Indian Act to remove the sexist discriminatory policies within it. And many suffered a lot of consequences in their own communities when they did so. We also had Cindy Blackstock that took the Canadian government to court to address the inequities within the child welfare system and inequitable resources and funding on indigenous children in our communities. So that'd be many. Also many women that are at the forefront of any new form of colonialism on our lands, fighting big companies, Trudeau and everybody, risking their lives. So we have many cases. And we have many pioneers that have established shelters and other programs that are culturally relevant, holistic, and to address the underlying root causes of this balance that many of our girls and women and boys are exposed every day, both in reserves and off reserves. So there are many cases. Allies have existed, continue to exist, and I hope many of you are. And here, as in women's studies and gender studies, for true feminist, so-called sister solidarity to happen, we need to have this intersectional framework when we talk about gender violence. And we know we need to work together to dismantle all systems of oppression and to recognize our own colonial privilege where it exists as a big want to fight against. Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Sorry, Dr. Sunseri, when you're making references to this, something that happened a few days ago, are you talking about the hit run?
Yeah, the van attack. Sorry, I'm assuming make assumptions. Yeah, the van attack in Toronto, which I used to live a block away from there. When I did my graduate studies at York, and I used to live just a block away from there. And looking at those pictures, and remember, I used to take a sidewalk every day. Like, I live just a few blocks away, so yeah. Because it has been kind of come out, although the police is very careful because they don't want to jeopardize their the case, so they're not really openly saying so. But there's been reports of a Facebook post that he made that very he followed the ideology of a group and a man that have killed, targeting women, and many of the women that victims are targeted with women. Yeah. And it's a very deliberate act of both misogynist and fragile masculinity, toxic masculinity, and also heterosexism. Definitely, these are definitely self-identified cisgender. Yeah.
Thank you for your wonderful talk.
Thanks.
It's really fantastic. I was thinking about intersectionality as you were speaking and the inquiry, and how amazing the inquiry has been when you go online, and they are trying to be as inclusive as possible, but I realize it's not just inclusive, it's intersectional, because they're also attending to two-spirit, transgender, ableism, and other issues that really have to be looked at in relationship to violence.
It's definitely like unfortunately I'm very short. I could do like many hours on this to cover that, and definitely we know that two-spirit and other queer identities are high risk in our communities. I don't know if anybody saw a post on it came out yesterday at the University of Victoria. Look it up. University of Victoria, the Indigenous Governance Program, it's under suspension because of a report that just finally came out of the place many of the students are in a very unsafe, toxic environment with their faculty and others due to very in terms of sexuality and also other identities, and so now they need to work that through, which definitely touch upon that that masculine privilege and a particular masculine privilege that is evident in there, that puts a lot of other individuals at risk in our communities. So definitely that's another lens to look at. Yeah.
I really enjoyed your talk, thank you. I'm really interested in, I don't know if you developed this or not, but sort of thinking through or hearing more about how you see us moving forward as a collective effort. And I know this is a big question. I just don't know if, partly because I teach criminology and sociology of law at Western here. And most of my lectures when it comes to feminism and Aboriginality always talks about how Indigenous people are not represented in the legal system, right? So we know that the legal system and the police themselves are not equipped, perhaps in many cases not willing, not interested, or unable to comprehend what this actually means. And I think the legal system is a really important part of moving forward in this because, like you said, when you make particular decisions and they come out, it has indications it means something for what we value. So I've seen, my end is always about the struggles about what the legal system doesn't do well. And so I guess part of what I'm wondering is, with this collective effort, do you see the legal system and the policing system itself being something that can help us move forward as a collective? And do you have any ideas about, these are big questions, just things I could talk to you about at lunch as well, but I just thought I'd raise it since you put it up there.
definitely and depends also which policing, like RCMP, or PNP, or like because indigenous peoples, and also indigenous policing as well, which exists to some extent. So we have different relationships. Some are better than others, depending on which levels. In terms of things have happened. I don't know if you just saw it as well. That just came out yesterday again. This ongoing issues of the Starlight tours in Saskatchewan. That policing, that we thought we dealt with, because we never really dealt with it. And therefore it's coming out again of especially males. This again, the different way gender is experiencing there. The indigenous male youth, especially, are particular different experiences around gender, and they're often more criminalized, it's a threat, and therefore over-policed, so on. And that's what happened with the Starlight tours. For those who don't know, those are cases where that's what the name is called, that police takes on some alleged usually youth, but that's not only youth, males most often, and then sometimes in a very cold weather, and they've died, put outside and leave them out, and then so it's a case of over policing and racialized, and so that's our experiences with which is not our own experience.
No, I know.
Many people of color, especially males, have unfortunately police and other has not been our friend, so at least to protect us. We don't often see it as a protector. Because often we see there are an encounter can lead to abuse of power and physical force and death, just like many other youth and minorities, that. So that's the issue. The Justice Sinclair, when Senator Sinclair, when in a TRC report, he highlight the justice system that needs reforms, and through the Cote-Bushi and Antina Fontaine, what happened, what transpired with that was a demand for reforms within the criminal justice system. Maybe the jury selection was one example of that, and the current justice minister has indicated this is going to happen, those reforms, and so on. And so we're hoping that eventually. But also for us, Indigenous women, it's to be self-determined and have a true nation-to-nation relationship. What we want, and that's we want to reestablish and have people respect our own Indigenous justice systems.
Yeah, I agree.
And that means restorative justice. Perhaps that means on way to conflict resolution, to also see us as equal partners. And that.
And integrating Indigenous law.
Yeah, and Indigenous law. So there's been an increase of that in some schools. Thank you. Thanks for coming.